Channel 31 acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land on which this episode was filmed, the Yuin peoples, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. We extend those respects to the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation, the land on which the Channel 31 studios are based. Hi, I'm Bridie Shepherd, and on the Eco Show today I'm visiting Black Duck Foods, where I'll be learning about traditional Indigenous agricultural practices, and I'm really excited to check it out. It's a beautiful misty morning here. I'm about to chat with author and farmer Bruce Pascoe to hear about his story and connection to this land. Could you begin by telling me a bit about the connection between culture and agriculture?
Aboriginal people never saw the difference. We always saw our economy tied up with the spirituality. And I think part of the problem with the environment today is that people separate the commerce from the cultural side of life, from the spiritual side of life. And I think that's why we get into so much trouble environmentally. We don't care enough about the earth. You know, we see the earth as our mother, and we're obliged to treat her accordingly. I think when you think like that, you start thinking differently about what you do.
And you must have seen quite a lot of changes both in Australia, but also in the landscape since you've been living here.
Yeah.
Especially, obviously, the fires.
Yeah.
What sort of role does fire have in the landscape and changing climate?
It has a cool role, a controlled role. It shouldn't be dominating us. Aboriginal people used it, were always in control of it. And we will have to get back to that again. We're trying to do that here on these hillsides. We're trying to burn them quietly because after the fires, we had incredible generation of grasses. And we realise now that we're going to have to burn every year, every couple of years, whatever the best sequence is, and learn how to use fire to promote our grasses, because they put carbon back in the soil, which the plants need. We're designing the farm along the lines that the old people used.
And so the grasses are actually sort of benefited by the fire?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. This whole property was burnt from edge to edge. You know, the whole bush was burnt. It just went on and on and on. Took 5 weeks here. Fire came from every direction, sometimes more than once. Saved this house, but lost a lot of other, lost fences, sheds, equipment. But our aim now is to burn regularly around the property and keep it safe.
And did I read correctly that you are actually in the CFA?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and during the fires, I was lucky to have my boat in the water so that I could go down to Malakoo, because all the roads were closed. And I was able to go down to Malakoo and get fuel. I ran around in a fire truck for a while, but I was always worried about my own place and my neighbours. It's a very unusual time, very hard to think about actually, because there was so much going on. And I've lost complete track of the time during those 5 weeks. I didn't, it was just like one long horrible day. yeah, I'm glad that they're gone.
Yeah, it sounds terrifying. But everything's going really well on the farm now. The crops seem to have responded really well. They've come back.
We lost all our kangaroo grass in the fire. I just watched it burn. I was really disappointed, as much for the people who worked on the farm as anyone, because they'd put so much work into it, and we'd been looking forward to it. We had the harvester out of the shed, and it was on the hillside. You know, literally we were going to harvest that day. You know, the fire came and we couldn't. But then after the fire we had good rain and another grass came up. A grass that we'd had before, but it became the dominant species. And that's Mamanja Nalok, dancing grass. Europeans call it weeping grass, but we were able to harvest that and turn it into flour and make bread from it. So that really picked up our spirits.
It's remarkable that you planted one crop, it was burnt, and then another crop came up that you were also able to harvest and use for flour.
It's telling us, what it was telling us was, you know, really pay attention to Australia. You know, these plants want to grow. We put all this effort and money into exotic grasses. You know, they really crop heavily, but geez, they rip the guts out of the ground. And that's why we're poisoning our ground, because we've done so much damage to it growing these crops that we have to supplement them with artificial fertilisers, superphosphate, weedicide, pesticide, you name it. It gets poured onto the poor old ground. And here are these crops that want to grow. They actually want to grow, and that's what the fires showed us, that those grasses were saying, well, I don't care. You know, I like this. I'm going to grow. So the fires had been and gone, and then we had the spring, and the canopy was gone in the forest, no leaves. And all this grass came up underneath it. And that's simply because of sunlight. I don't know where the seed came from. Obviously it was there on the ground. And suddenly we had all these grasses, and we're building a harvester now. Local Aboriginal man in Eden is building it for us, so that we can sneak in amongst the trees and harvest those grasses. So it's a pretty important venture, in that it might mean that we can have a forest and harvest it too, because that's what the old people did. They got their food out of the forest. They weren't discriminating between a beautiful forest and a place where they could gather food. And I think we might have to do that in Australia again.
And just finally, what's your vision for Black Duck Foods in the future?
Well, we look after the ground, we care for Mother Earth, we grow food, we process it, bake bread for people, get vegetables for people, get salad vegetables for people, but that we employ Aboriginal people. The whole idea is that this is an Aboriginal enterprise, and that the people who work here take the money that they earn home to their children, their families, and we develop a prosperous economy for Aboriginal people. You know, we'll need government support, but we want our people to be independent of government. We want to be part of Australia. You know, we're not stupid. White people aren't going to go away, neither are we. We're going to have to work together. But we do want to be part of the nation. We don't want to be pensioners in the country. We want to be a dynamic part of it, and we want to be able to share it with you and share our knowledge. And a lot of our knowledge has been taken away, but so much of it we're gaining again. And that's the whole idea of this property, is that we all work together and we learn stuff every day. We've learnt so much about our forest in this last few years, and we'll learn more.
All right, thank you so much for talking with me today. It's just been an honour to meet you.
Good on you. It was lovely to see you all.
Now the clouds have cleared, I found a spot with a view to chat with Chris Andrews about the Black Duck food story. So can you begin by telling me a bit about Black Duck Foods?
Yeah, we're an Indigenous social enterprise. We got going sort of properly at around November 2019, so just at the tail end of the drought, just before the bushfires, and then we joined everybody in COVID. So we've had a fairly challenging sort of year and a bit as a startup organisation, but fortunately we're still around, and obviously we're proceeding and doing more and more each day.
What are you farming here?
What are we farming? Well, we're undertaking sort of a resurrection of sorts of some of the traditional agricultural practices and traditional food systems. So we're taking the stock off, and we've let the native grasses come through, and so we're harvesting those and seeing how we process that. A bit further down the hill, we'll get down to a little bit later on, is some murnong, some other tubers. And then we're basically farming country and looking at what country yields us in terms of opportunities for food systems, and really importantly, opportunities for developing Indigenous businesses out of what we're trying to do. So there's a lot going on the farm, but there's also a lot of what we try and do outside of the farm to influence those businesses growing as well.
So the main objective is not necessarily to sort of have a high yield output?
I think the main objective is to try and rediscover what's been here for thousands and thousands of generations and adapt some of those practices that were historically done before colonisation and sort of the willful damage of country, and look at that in a context of how we then create that back into Australia's traditional food system. And in doing that, look at farming practices, technology, legislation, nutritional values, all those sorts of things. So a lot of that happens here in terms of practicing what we need to do and learning and making mistakes so we can share that. And then a lot of it is advocating for that outside of the farm and sharing what we're trying to do here with the mobs outside. Each mob are going to have their own food story. Ours is to sort of share our yarn, and I think it's really important we're not telling people how to do it. We just want to share a story. This is what we've tried, but it's going to be different on different countries. So it's really important for us is to create a safe space to invite people to hear our yarn, to share that yarn, and do it in a really respectful sort of way.
And so have you noticed any changes to the landscape since you've been working here?
No, absolutely.
Yep.
So Bruce bought the property a couple of years before sort of Black Duck came of age. And just taking off the stock, it allowed some of the native grasses to come back. So we're seeing a variety of different species come through and just heal. And we're seeing soil recover. We're seeing grasses and the kikuyu now compete more and more with some of the native grasses. And certainly after the fires that took out the kikuyu, we saw an abundance of some of these grasses come through. So, slowly this country's healing, and with that healing, it's rediscovering its traditional food story.
Where does the name Black Duck actually come from?
Black Duck Foods, yeah, we're gifted that in terms of it's the totem for this area. And so we have an Indigenous and a Yuin majority board. Unlike other sort of standard organisations that have a board, our board's then answerable to elders of the Yuin community, and they sought their permission to use the totem as our company name. And with that permission, we operate. So we feel we've got a cultural licence to operate because of that connection and that authority, and that allows us to operate on Yuin Country as a Yuin business and then grow Yuin foods. We are a startup. It's just our technology is 65,000 years old.
And so that cultural element is really informs everything that you do?
It gives us licence to operate. So without that authority, we wouldn't have this business, and nor would we want to seek that. So it gives us the cultural licence, it gives us that connection to country, and it's a framework we get invited into. So as a non-Indigenous person, I'm invited in onto this country to operate under that framework. And it's also about telling a lot more people about understanding an Indigenous framework as opposed to non-Indigenous or a colonisation framework, because what we can't keep doing is forcing Indigenous people to work under a non-Indigenous or a colonial framework. And we've seen the result of that. And it's not something that any of us should be proud of, and it lacks a lot of our humanity that we've allowed it to go to where it is now. And it's time to sort of start saying, white fella laws don't actually work that well for black fellas. That we need to be more respectful of the traditional owners and the original nations people and understand how they operated on this country and move to be invited into their framework instead of forcing them into these artificial frameworks that we've created here over the last 250 years.
And so you see Black Duck Foods as potentially being a new framework to move forward?
We're an example. You know, again, we don't flatter ourselves like we're the answer. We're a company trying to operate in a way, and there's lots of other really good Indigenous organisations out there doing fantastic work, and we just want to add to that mix and add to it in the way that we're doing things within sort of the traditional food sector, and sort of tell people that it's just more than food. You know, when we talk about that, that sort of puts us into a category, but a lot more of what we're doing is about the people, about the culture, about the story, about what it does for this nation, about what it does for the soul. It's about morality. You know, there's a whole lot of other things, and a lot of people struggle with that, so we talk about food. And through food, we can have that other yarn once they're sitting at a table. And for people that don't get the whole traditional grain story or the tuber of the tradition, I'm not sure what universe they live in, because how do they feel that people survive for so many thousands of generations on this country? They were doing, in white fella terms, agriculture. Have to have been, it's proven, it's out there, makes complete sense to anybody. So we're just embodying what had already been done and readapting it for 250 years later, where the soil's not the same as it was. There's an awful lot of damage done, and so some of the stories from elders have got to be adapted to some of the conditions we find ourselves in now. But at the heart of it, at the core of it, the cultural and the significant importance of what we're trying to do is still there. And it's that real connection to country.
Great, thank you so much for chatting with me this morning, Chris.
Pleasure, Bridie. Let's go have a cuppa.
Sounds good. As well as Indigenous grasses, the team here are growing other native foods on the land. One of these is murnong. Murnong is a member of the Australian yam family and is also known as a yam daisy. It was a major food source for Indigenous Australians before colonisation, and Indigenous peoples had many nuanced ways of cultivating it. I'm about to get a tour of the garden from Chris and Terry, who are relearning the techniques of their ancestors.
These are the native murnong. We've got two different species in this garden. This one's what we call the alpina, and this one over here is the scapageria. These are more the mountain murnong. So basically all these gardens here we've grown, we harvest the seed off them. We also let a little bit drop into the ground so that they will keep making more murnong, so this whole thing will be just full and it'll stop weeds from coming through and stuff like that. Yeah, I think we'll just dig it up with the hands and have a bit of a look.
Great.
We've actually pulled this one out of the ground before.
Yep.
And taken a few tubers off it. But that's basically sort of like a parsnip, I guess.
Yep.
And yeah, considered a superfood. Really, really good for you. So.
The team at Black Duck are trying to propagate and grow as much murnong as they can and are learning more about the plant every day.
These were nearly all extinct at one stage, so we basically trying to bring them back, and harvesting the seeds. Like when we first had this garden, there was probably only 9 of these, and we've harvested seeds from them plants, and this is the first year we've done this. We've got a few hundred in here now.
Yep.
So, and probably each murnong plant, you'll probably collect, a good 500 seeds just off one plant.
Yeah, which we've been propagating. We've got a little nursery where we've just been propagating so we can just keep continually building and building rather than it being a lost food, Indigenous food.
The foliage of the murnong die off at certain times of the year and can be burnt down to ensure they regenerate, growing back fuller and stronger. This burn technique also ensures phosphorus and potassium are returned to the soil to promote the health of the next crop. Much of this cultivation knowledge was lost due to European colonisation. But the team here are using information they have found from historical sources as well as a system of trial and error to maintain these native plants. I was keen to get a taste of the Murnong and learned they have a similar texture to radishes.
Anyone else want to try?
Yeah.
Chris and Terry have some harvested speargrass to show me. Once you separate the awn and spikes on the grass, it can be ground down to make flour. Native grass flour is a great alternative to wheat flour for those with gluten intolerances.
Terry done the harvest last year of the Microlina, which is the first Microlina harvest in 200 plus years, I believe.
Yep. Wow. From down this area, like.
Yep, and it was from this area and just down the hill, and they got a really good outcome. So Microlina seems to be quite easy to work with.
Yep.
Probably a bit easier than the speargrass and the kangaroo grass, but we're all learning, and yeah.
To finish off a beautiful day here on the farm, I sat down amongst the kangaroo grass with Wayne Tupper to learn more about the black duck food story.
I think the thing that I find really fascinating is the connection between stories and eating and the land.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about those sorts of connections, and what have you noticed since you've been working here?
Well, the stories that I guess Black Duck Foods is, it's founded on the stories of the explorers, through the book that Bruce Pascoe wrote, Dark Emu. So food and the way that I think a lot of people in Australia think about Indigenous economy and food, that connection to story is not always an element that is a well-known one. Black Duck Foods has its story by virtue of the fact of uncovered knowledge that Bruce Pascoe brought back into our culture through the words of the explorers, and story and food and land are all totally 100% connected in an Indigenous context. Indigenous culture is an oral culture. It's about stories and about stories being passed down. And a lot of those stories have been lost. Part of what's happening, I think, through Black Duck Foods, sort of following its story, it's giving people the opportunity to shift their perspective slightly, because we're working in a very different landscape now to the landscape of 200 years ago.
Yeah, so you're not looking to necessarily just look back and take a story from the past and then use that, but you're also looking to sort of incorporate what's currently happening to the land,
Absolutely.
including things like climate change and a changing landscape.
Indeed, yeah. The value of promoting perennial grasses, we're looking at perennial grasses as food plants, but perennial grasses are also sequestering carbon, keeping soil in place. There's always ground cover with perennial grasses. Ground's never bare. Perennial grasslands are a way of reinvigorating the land, but the land has changed so much, and the relationships between plants and the land has changed so much. So here we haven't lost a whole lot of topsoil. It was always, relatively hard, but in some areas, the amount of topsoil that was there, like over vast areas of the landscape, the soil was deep and rich and friable, and we've lost that. And like the boys were saying this morning, they almost, that Murnong particularly, people say that was almost gone. And it's not hard to imagine that with the way that country has been treated. So we can plant it back in, we can plant it again. And that's the intention, is to have plenty of seeds so people can share it and plant that plant again, and hopefully it will proliferate. But it's growing in a very different environment to what it was growing in 200 years ago.
And can you tell me about the kangaroo grass that we're sitting amongst? Was this planted here by black ducks?
No, this is just naturally occurring here. As you can see, there's a fair bit of it right where we're sitting now. This grass was in the summer of 2000. This whole hillside was covered in kangaroo grass, and it was just about to be harvested when the bushfires came through. And the bushfires took out all of the kangaroo grass, a week before it was, well, probably really, almost at the exact time that it was, harvest was due. All of this country was all burnt. So all of these grasses were burnt. You can see it's come back pretty well. And what replaced the kangaroo grass in that season was dancing grass. And these paddocks were they were almost like 100% dancing grass. this grass here, you know, like you can see it's going pretty well. And we'll see what it's like next year. There might be lots of it, there might not be lots. Yeah, but yeah, it's a beautiful thing. Just watching it, you know, watching it do its thing.
It's been incredibly fascinating visiting Black Duck Foods today and learning about the rich agricultural history that Australia has. Thanks for watching. I'm Bridie Shepherd and this is The Eco Show.